A few questions on the amendment through the proponent through you.
Please proceed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the intent of the amendment. The original bill I was severely concerned with. I still do have some concerns on the amendment. I do appreciate the ranking member and the chair and the vice chair getting together to make the bill better. But I do have a few questions. In the opening, it defines expanded polycystyrene, and I was just curious what the alternative would be if this amendment were to pass and the bill were to become law. What would the alternative be to the styrofoam containers through you, Mr. Speaker?
Representative D'Amico.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, there are currently several alternatives to the expanded polystyrene. The ones that come to mind are paper, cardboard, plastic, aluminum foil containers, all of which are much more readily recyclable than polystyrene. I'm also given to understand that there are plant-based products that also are used for packaging or for made into containers for both beverages and food. So there are several alternatives. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, sir. Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And does the proponent, is the proponent aware of the costs of any of those alternatives through you?
Representative D'Amico.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, I guess the way I would choose to answer that question is that, of course, by shopping around, restaurateurs and caterers can try to find, the most economical alternative to the polystyrene, and I'm sure that they will continue to do that. But I would like to point out, in answer to that there is a cost that goes beyond merely the point of sale. There is an environmental cost. A societal cost to these products. There are recycling costs to the products that we're debating here today. So cost has more of an impact beyond simply a point of sale. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman for his answer. So just to clarify, we don't have any specific numbers on the styrofoam containers versus the alternatives at this point. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative D'Amico.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I am given to understand that there are products that are available at a comparable cost. I do not have the specific numbers for the gentleman. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll move on to a separate line of questioning. In the bill, line 16 and 17, it states that, in the amendment, line 16 and 17 says that no owner or operator of a restaurant or catering business shall provide or distribute a single-use container to a customer, which I would assume is the crux of this amendment. Through you, Mr. Speaker, our restaurants are not defined in this amendment. So through you, are restaurants defined as per statute, or is this a vague definition? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative D'Amico.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I believe it is by statute. That's my understanding. Through you.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So does the proponent believe that any business that sells food in any way would be affected by this amendment? Through you. Representative
D'Amico.
Through you, Mr. Speaker. No, my understanding is that for example, food cart vendors and as I mentioned earlier, nursing homes and institutions would be exempted from the provisions of this legislation. Strictly, as I mentioned previously, this is strictly limited to restaurants and catering businesses. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So just to clarify for legislative intent, I would assume a fine dining restaurant would be included, a casual restaurant would be included. Specifically stated that food trucks were exempt. I don't see that in the amendment. What about a hot dog stand or a roadside eatery? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative D'Amico.
Well, Through you, Mr. Speaker, I don't believe that a hot dog stand would qualify as a restaurant. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the answer. So I guess my question is, what does constitute a restaurant? Through you.
Representative D'Amico.
If I may have a moment, Mr.
The Chamber will stand at ease, yes. Chamber will come back to order. Representative D'Amico.
Mr. Speaker, I'm given to understand that restaurant is defined in other statutes, which I do not have readily available. So this may take a little while. If the gentleman would care to move on to something else, and we will get him an answer. Through you.
Representative Sredzinski, does that work for you?
I cleared my day, so I have no problem waiting.
Glad to hear that, sir. I cleared mine as well. Would you care to proceed with other questions?
Sure, I do have a few other questions, so we can move on. So I know one of the original bills, whether it was this one or another concept in the Environment Committee, eliminated the use of styrofoam trays. I know that my Board of Education reached out to me. They had some severe concerns because of the costs of styrofoam trays that they currently use versus the different styrofoam trays. So through you, Mr. Speaker, are styrofoam trays included in this or just containers?
Representative D'Amico.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, we are strictly talking in this bill about food and beverage containers and not trays. Through you.
Representative Sredzinski.
Okay, so it leads me to another question. As most of us prepare to come up to the Capitol, we stop at a coffee place, whether it's a local mom and pop or a Starbucks or a Dunkin' Donuts. And as we all know, if you get a hot coffee from Dunkin' Donuts, you get it, if you get anything bigger than a small, you get it in a styrofoam cup. Would that be included as an exclusion in this bill, or would styrofoam Dunkin' Donuts cups be illegal if this bill were to pass through you?
Representative D'Amico.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, the styrofoam cups, since they are beverage containers, would be included in the provisions of this bill. And I would point out to the gentleman this proposed legislation does not take effect until January 1st of 2021, and it is my understanding that many operations, such as he is describing, are planning to phase out the use of these polystyrene cups in the very near future. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is there a state in which we have seen styrofoam cups be made illegal? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative D'Amico.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, it's my understanding that the District of Columbia, which of course is not a state, enacted similar legislation, as did the state of Maine, as did North Carolina. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And what are the large Dunkin' Donuts coffees being served in those states? Through you.
Representative D'Amico.
I must confess, Mr. Speaker, that the gentleman has me at a disadvantage. I do not know, but I would imagine that any one of those alternatives that were mentioned earlier, alternative products, probably are in use. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate the answers from the good chairman. It's just, again, not serving on Environment Committee. I want to make sure that some of my questions get addressed. I will move on to lines 18 through 21. Lines 18 through 21 detail the fines that are applied to any owner or operator of a restaurant or catering business. And in section 19, in line 19, the first violation is $250. The second violation is $500. And for a third or subsequent violation, it's $1,000 per violation. While I think that these violations are quite expensive and quite steep, I understand that they're probably there in order to push for compliance. So my question to the proponent is, are those fines adequate or are they too high, through you, Mr. Speaker?
Representative D'Amico.
Through you, excuse me, through you, Mr. Speaker. No, I don't believe that the fines are too high. As the gentleman indicates, I believe that they are adequate to dissuade people from violating this proposed law. Through you.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for his answer. In the event that one of the Dunkin' Donuts in their state fails to get the memo, or they have a stock of Styrofoam cups in the back, and after this law goes into effect in 2021, let's say it's 2022, and the staff goes and gets those emergency Styrofoam cups and serves 30 of them. Is that one violation, or is that 30 violations, through you, Mr. Speaker?
Representative D'Amico.
Well, through you, Mr. Speaker, I guess I would answer that in two different ways. As the gentleman knows, lines 28 through 33 indicate the enforcement entities for this legislation: the Department of Public Health, local health departments and health districts, and so forth, Department of Consumer Protection. So I think I will leave it to them to make that determination. And secondarily, I would point out to the gentleman that lines 34 through 43 indicate that a report will be given to the legislature 1 year after this legislation goes into effect, assuming it goes into effect, which will indicate any hardships that a particular business might have with this legislation. So hopefully that will satisfy his concerns. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do appreciate that reporting back. But my concern is that if we feel that this has a potential to negatively impact businesses, then why are we bringing this bill and this amendment out today? Why not evaluate that, discuss it, talk about it, which I believe the Environment Committee did, and hold off on imposing this? With quick math on my phone, if that example that I gave, that Dunkin' Donuts in 2022 serves 30 Styrofoam containers, and if DPH, the municipality, whoever's in charge of enforcing it, if they decide that they want to hammer that business, that's going to cost that business $27,750 for 30 Styrofoam cups. That is very steep, and that is a lot of coffee for people to make up the cost for. Nearly $28,000 in fines, which are permissible in this bill. I understand that judgment can be used. However, that type of extent of punishment, I believe, is unfair to small businesses. And of course, Dunkin' Donuts, the example I gave, is a large corporation. But this could apply to anyone that has a small business. I just feel that we're setting up our small businesses that are in this position in a dangerous situation. But I will move on to my next line of questioning. Through you, Mr. Speaker, has the proponent received any information on the question I asked earlier? Through you.
Representative D'Amico.
Yes, through you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the good representative for his patience. So a restaurant is defined in statute as a space in a suitable and permanent building, kept, used, maintained, advertised, and held out to the public to be a place where meals are regularly served to the public. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so just to clarify, food trucks, hot dog stands, since they're not constructed buildings, would not apply. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative D'Amico.
I believe the gentleman is correct. Through you.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Moving on to line 25 through 27 of the amendment, there's an exception for a butcher or store to contain raw meat, beef, poultry, seafood, or pork. Can I ask the good chairman what the intention of that exclusion is? Through you.
Representative D'Amico.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Speaker, there was some concern about to whom this legislation would apply. So we wanted to make it clear, based on the original bill that came out of the Environment Committee, that there would be an exemption, so there would be no question for the circumstance that the gentleman just detailed. Through you.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the reason I ask the question is often restaurants, as I understand them, don't serve raw meat, beef, poultry, seafood, or pork, with the exception of sushi or some more adventurous eateries. So my understanding, if this included grocery stores, I could see that being an exception. But having restaurants, so is the chairman, is the proponent of the amendment aware of any restaurants that serve raw meat through you?
Representative D'Amico.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, no, I am not aware. Through you.
What's that?
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And moving on to the end where there are some exceptions, I just want to confirm for clarity, and I know that the good ranking member on environment asked this question, but schools and their styrofoam trays or containers are not included in this amendment in any way. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative D'Amico.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is correct.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the good chairman for answering my questions, for getting some research done on restaurants. I still have some concerns about the extent of the fines and the way that this will get rolled out. I know that there will be plenty of notice. Although there's no fiscal note on the amendment, I'm not sure how either DEP or DPH or our local municipalities are going to be able to enforce this without adding some sort of staff or including their workload in some way. And if this truly is going to become a problem for the state of Connecticut, I wanted to make sure that we do enforce it because, you know, we have laws, we should enforce our laws. That being said, I think the example I gave of someone accidentally serving 30 styrofoam cups a few years from now, I think that's a major concern. And I think that $28,000 in fines is excessive. I think it's too much. I think this sends a wrong message to our small businesses, the restaurants, and I would urge rejection of the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.